Hello, hello, everybody. Welcome back. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Gavin Fish. This is our channel. Today, we have a special guest. I'm really excited to introduce you to Brian Bennett, who is a retired law enforcement officer down in the state of South Carolina. He is also a full-time law enforcement instructor, and he has specific expertise on how do I say this? You guys know we want to remain monetized here, but the method in which Madeline Soto died, he has specific expertise. I'm not going to dance around that word for long, just kind of in the beginning of the video so that YouTube will let this video go out to more people. So without further ado, let me just bring him on. This is Brian Bennett. Brian, welcome. Welcome. Thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you very much for the opportunity.
So I'm glad that you reached out to me. This, like a little inside baseball to our viewers. There are a lot of ways that you can reach out to me. You can do it through the fish tank or through Facebook or through my website. But Brian reached out to me and said, "Hey, I have this particular expertise and I'd love to talk to you about it." And I invited him on the show because we know that Madeline Soto, she was murdered, right? But they kind of let slip in the documentation the manner, well, I guess the cause of her death. The manner of her death was homicide, but the cause of her death was actually strangulation. And that is your specific expertise, correct?
That is correct.
So tell me a little bit about your background. Hopefully, I just want to make sure that everybody can hear you. Can you? I think we're fine on the volume there. But
Yeah.
tell me about your background a little bit, as far as like the whole kit and caboodle. But let's get into the strangulation thing because this is an important piece of the Madeline Soto case, right?
Thank you. I graduated from the University of South Carolina in the mid '90s, where I got my criminal justice degree, and I went directly into law enforcement with one of our larger cities here in South Carolina, and kind of made my way through some local departments, and ultimately in 2007, I ended as a domestic violence and vulnerable adult specialist instructor at our state police academy in South Carolina. And interesting to that is every law enforcement officer in South Carolina that is not a federal officer has to come through the same central academy. And so I specialized in those areas. And
So you
then
could be a state trooper or a state officer, whatever you guys call it in South Carolina, or you could be podunk little police force in a small little municipality. You're all getting the exact same training.
Right. All the basic training occurs together and integrated with city police officers, county deputies, and all various levels of state law enforcement, which we have quite a few different levels here in South Carolina. And so those were my specialties coming into the academy, was domestic violence issues, intimate partner violence, and vulnerable adults. And it wasn't until about 2015 that I got the opportunity to attend some specialized, very intensive training on non-fatal strangulation assaults, and it was actually offered to federal prosecutors through the federal government. But since it was being held in South Carolina, I got special permission to go. And my education in the strangulation area has continued since then. It hasn't stagnated. So I continually take more and more advanced courses, but in every one of those instances, those curriculums were taught by forensic pathologists, were taught by prosecutors of various levels, retired law enforcement officers. And so I want to make very clear, I'm not a forensic pathologist, I'm not a clinician, but I've been taught by some of the best forensic pathologists, doctors, clinicians, and attorneys in the United States.
So
And
for everybody else, like a forensic pathologist, that is a medical doctor. That is what we would call a medical examiner, is a forensic pathologist, right? So it's not like you have your medical degree, but you've been trained by those who do. Is that what you're saying?
yeah, exactly. So some of my instructors were some of the most prominent forensic pathologists specific to strangulation, not just in the United States, but in the entire world.
Wow.
And along with that, I always thought it was beneficial to get as much additional training in all areas of law enforcement that I could, So I've attended probably 35 or 40 different schools, everything from criminal interrogation to tactical operations, crime scene processing. But I really like to focus on death pathology, or the pathology of wounds and wound progression. And out of that strangulation indoctrination, I guess you could say, came a stark realization for me as a law enforcement officer
Okay.
that many of the cases that I dealt with prior to that specific training, I missed a lot of subtle signs and symptoms
Oh,
of,
wow.
of strangulation, only because I didn't know any better. I didn't know what I didn't know. And I'm sure we'll talk about it a little bit later, but that is part of the problem here, is that the subtle signs and symptoms and the dangers of strangulation aren't fully known to most people. So, in following up that strangulation training, I actually went through what's called the didactic program. That is the academic program for a forensic nurse examiner. I'm not a registered nurse, but I was allowed and given special permission to go through the academic training of a forensic nurse, and passed all those tests. And so I've just continued to grow this medical, physiological, forensic, criminal justice kind of
I have a question.
specialty.
I'm sorry to like interrupt, but I have a question. A forensic nurse, what is the, I guess, academic um, study of forensic nursing? What's the difference between that and like forensic pathology, or like a forensic doctor?
Right. So a forensic pathologist, and this is a really interesting statement that you kind of touched on. Here in South Carolina, our coroners are elected, but our medical examiners, they have to have an MD, a medical degree.
That's the way it is in Pennsylvania,
Some,
where I live. Yeah.
many of the autopsies are done by medical doctors, but if you talk to a forensic pathologist, they will say there's a big difference between someone with an MD and someone with an MD with 8 special years of forensic pathology trained to look at the dead, in that a regular MD may miss something because they're trained to look at the living, whereas a forensic pathologist is trained to look at the dead.
Right.
So, those doctors have 8 more years of specialized training. A forensic nurse, in most cases, has to be a registered nurse. They have to have a bachelor's degree in nursing, but they go through a curriculum that specializes them in the detection and documentation of injuries related to domestic violence, sexual assault, and interpersonal violence. And that's not just in the patient triage and care, but they become a very critical component of collecting forensic evidence. We typically associate, a law enforcement officer or a crime scene unit or an investigator with collecting forensic evidence. But when it comes to, the biological evidence and trace evidence related to intimate partner violence or sexual assaults, the forensic nurses have a very unique understanding and a protocol to follow that makes their collection much more accurate, not just in documentation, but in what they look at and what they see that other people may miss.
So let me ask you this: when it comes to forensic nursing, then, I had never considered that. So, say somebody is a victim of SA, and they, they call the police. An investigation is happening at the moment, right? And they are taken to the hospital. I read this in criminal complaints, like with too much frequency, where they're taken to the local hospital where an examination is done. And there are some cases where I've seen the evidence that was later submitted in court, right? So I've seen this stuff. So is that typical to have the nurse or the person who is collecting that evidence? Is it typical that person is a forensic nurse, or is that something that is so specialized that maybe most hospitals don't have that?
Right. Well, it's sad to say there's not enough forensic nurses. They're also called, and this is the actual term, there's 2 terms that are used: sexual assault nurse examiner, which is called SANE, or a FNE, forensic nurse examiner. They essentially do the same thing. There is a desperate need to have more of them. Not every hospital has them. Not every hospital system has them on call. So what happens sometimes is there are these evidence collection kits that sometimes are stored at the hospital, but are sometimes brought to the hospital by the law enforcement investigative entity to collect this trace evidence.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a nurse or a doctor or other technician that is not specifically trained in the forensic nurse examiner field, they will miss some of the evidence that a forensic nurse might not have missed. So
Okay.
what happens sometimes is those kits are done, but the collection is not as good as it could be.
Gotcha.
So what I always recommend from our law enforcement officers is if number one, get them to the hospital, but number two, desperately plead for a forensic nurse examiner to do that exam and not just your everyday emergency room triage nurse. Although they're great, they don't have that specialized training, and
Yeah.
it can be problematic.
So I was in, I told you before we came on, I was in court last week covering a case. Every time I say I was in court, it makes me sound like I'm a lawyer and I was a party to it. I was not. I was a reporter sitting in the gallery. But we live in a small area, and of course, we all know each other on a first name basis. I know the DA, I know the public defender, the sheriff, I know them all, right? And I was chatting with our local sheriff, and I I don't want to, like, I got to be careful about this because I'll try to keep it as bland as I can. But he talked about how over the course of a long career, uh, you might, quote unquote, lose your soul as a police officer. You've seen so much, and sometimes you've even sacrificed your personal relationships because of it. And he was describing to me how, you know, one thing just kind of one horrible tragedy just kind of bleeds into another horrible tragedy, and it is the chain of those things throughout his entire career. What do police officers have to do? Like you just described, okay, I've got a victim. I'm going to the hospital. I'm going to try to get this evidence collected. I now have to be an advocate for the victim, right? And an advocate for actually the prosecutors later on. I've got to get this evidence. How, as a police officer, do you maintain your like humanity uh, and act as you're saying, like be an advocate? How do you do that?
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with compartmentalization. The law enforcement psyche is another topic that we could speak for hours on. I would say that not every law enforcement officer is cut out to be a law enforcement officer.
Mm,
This job does, in fact, expose you to a lot of everybody's happy to see a firefighter. Not many people are happy to see a law
sure.
enforcement officer because they know that something really, really bad has either happened to them, or as a criminal, something really bad is getting ready to happen to them with an arrest or something.
Yeah.
And law enforcement officers are exposed to a lot of violent and traumatic events, but also a lot of heartbreaking events as well.
Right.
And what a law enforcement officer has to realize relatively quickly is not that you become unhuman, but the emotions that you would normally express as a heartfelt feeling emotional creature have to be put aside in order to get to the work,
Hmm.
because without you many things would not get done, which ultimately should serve to take care of and protect those who've been hurt, but also to provide justice to them and justice against those who've done wrong. And being emotional in that situation causes people to make really bad decisions. And I'll make this real quick distinction.
All right.
The brain, part of the division that I was in was called the behavioral science unit. So the psychology and sociology people is also part of what I do. But the brain can only really operate in two different modes: emotion or logic.
Okay.
And often, when people operate in an emotional state, their logic side of their brain is depressed, so they make really bad decisions. This is where people usually get panicked over financial situations and make really bad financial
Hmm.
decisions. Or, unfortunately, you see officers use excessive force. And almost exclusively, when you see that happen, they're operating out of emotion, not logic, because in their logical mind, if they realize what they were doing, they would realize they're going too far. So, officers have to keep those emotions in check to focus on the logic of getting the job done as accurately and as correctly as possible. And sometimes that comes across as being unfeeling, but it's not meant to be. It's just that if we let our emotions take over, and again, if we've got a heart for people, which many of us do, we would not be able to complete our job. And so it has to be compartmentalizing the job. And then it's usually when everything's done and we're in the quiet of our own time and place that the emotional side comes to the surface and we have to deal with it.
Well, thanks for that explanation. Okay, so we are now 15 minutes into this, Brian. I can't even believe how fast the time goes. And we haven't really broached the subject of Madeline Soto. So just so everybody knows, and everybody, if you want to submit a question for Brian, I see a couple in there already. Just put GF in your comment so that I will see it, and we'll get some questions up here. But let's talk about Madeline for just a second. We don't know much. We don't have a autopsy report. The state of Florida is saying that they're not going to release an autopsy report because she was a minor. And I think that that's probably a good thing to do, especially to protect their case. The state of Florida, though, does release surprisingly a lot of information to the public. They have very open public records laws. And so we know that Madeline died by strangulation after living a life of like 5 of her 13 years at least. She was a victim of sexual assault by Mr. Stearns. So what are some of the telltale, and I'm sorry, I'm so scatterbrained about this. You talked about the difference between non-fatal and fatal strangulation wounds. In this case, obviously, we're talking about a fatal wound. But what are some of the telltale signs that investigators would be looking for and ultimately the pathologist would have found in order to rule her cause of death strangulation?
Going to this from like the first responder aspect to the medical examiner aspect. So first responder, now this is going to really surprise a lot of people. 20 or 25 years ago within the law enforcement field, we were taught to look for marks on the neck, and we were taught to look for petechial hemorrhages, which are burst capillaries in the whites of the eyes. And if we saw those would strongly indicate strangulation.
And those are telltale signs, are they not?
And they could be, but it was kind of, back then it was kind of focused, that was the end all be all. I mean, that was like the absolute.
Yeah, look for A and B, and that'll tell.
Right.
Okay.
But really that was bad science back then. It had some basis in observable or observations by specialists, but it didn't fully explore all the medical physiological responses of the body and the causes of those responses. So the stark statistic is one that surprises people. 50% of strangulation cases, both fatal and non-fatal, will have no external injuries on the body that you can see.
Half you cannot see.
Yeah. Even in fatal cases, the body may have absolutely no external injuries whatsoever. So when you're using your eyes for visual purposes and you're looking for those marks on the neck or the petechial hemorrhages and they aren't there, back in the day, the person was automatically discounted. It's like, okay, well, then you weren't strangled.
Oh, so like the victim would tell police, no, he grabbed me by the neck, or whoever grabbed me by the neck. Look. And they're like, can't see anything. No, you weren't. You're a liar.
Yeah. And we also have to understand that, many times when people are strangled, they don't report to law enforcement at all. And if they do, it's usually hours or days later. And so where if we got there really quickly, there might be a little bit of surface redness that we could see. But, 30 minutes later, it may be gone. There may be no external injuries that are observable. So, again, 50% of cases are not going to have any external signs of injury on the body. And what's really interesting is that the external injuries that we see, although they're more prominent, they are less frequent than the more subtle signs and symptoms, because the more subtle signs and symptoms are actually more frequent. And some of those are speaking with an altered voice. In about 50% of strangulation cases, the victim will have an altered voice due to the trauma to the vocal cords and trauma to the nerves that control the throat area.
Does that
So
last more than just right after? I mean, the vocal folds I know are what is the word that I'm looking for? They are easily injured, right?
mhm.
They're
so
delicate, I
so
guess
that
is.
yeah, that altered voice can last for days, months, and even be permanent in some cases.
Oh wow. Okay.
Yeah, so an altered voice. Sometimes there's complaints of a headache. That's due to some vascular changes in the brain and in the head. There might be an expression of soreness in the neck. But even if they don't express these things, you may see them having trouble swallowing. You may see someone having trouble breathing. I tell people, when it comes to wound pathology, the body has a process of healing in whatever injury the body suffers. There's a healing process.
Yeah.
And the easiest way for me to describe this is, everybody can remember probably a time when they were running running, whether it's dodgeball or kickball or football, and they twisted their ankle, it hurt, they fell down, they rubbed it out and played the rest of the game, and everything seemed fine. Well, then the next day, their ankle's the size of a grapefruit.
Right.
Well, that can happen. That can happen to the muscles in the neck. That can happen to the tendons. That can also happen to the airway. So 1 minute someone could be breathing fine, and 2 hours from now they can barely breathe at all because the airway has started to swell shut. So breathing changes, swallowing changes, pain. There can also be a memory loss, which we can get into in more technical maybe a little bit later, but memory loss. So the person is confused, or what we say has stupor. They don't really know where they are. They can't really process answering questions very well. They kind of seem out there, but that's a stupor caused by some lack of oxygen. We also have involuntary urinary incontinence and bowel incontinence. That is very subtle. That usually
in non-fatal stuff.
In non-fatal, yes. So
wow.
when someone goes, when someone is strangled to the point of unconsciousness, which means their brain is shut down due to lack of oxygen, it is possible for them to have urinary and bowel incontinence because the autonomic system that controls the muscles in the top of our stomach, the lower part of our bowels and our bladder aren't working anymore, so those muscles relax. And what's really interesting about that is some of your strangulation victims who have suffered a non-fatal event, they don't even know that this has happened, and if they do, they generally throw those clothes away or they throw them in the wash, but that is evidence of a loss of consciousness, and sometimes the clothes that they present in aren't the clothes that the attack occurred in, right, because of embarrassment. But it doesn't happen in all cases, but it can happen.
I guess bringing this back around to Madeline, and I want to take that stair step. I want to keep going on that, but bringing that back to Madeline, I mean, she was in Stephen Stern's car on security camera, on like traffic cameras and stuff like that. She was described as like slumped over. The way Stephen Stearns described it was her head was back. He was trying to tell police that she was sleeping, right? And so, yeah, I remember as a teenager sleeping in the car like that, I guess. But I think what we've learned here is like half the time, even if they had high resolution 8K video of Madeline in the car, they may not see, it's actually a coin toss whether or not they would see any type of bruising or anything on her neck, having been a victim of a fatal strangulation. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. With the way cameras are these days, I mean, I've seen some cameras that the feds use that are 36 megapixel. I mean, they literally could zoom into the pupil of your eye from miles away. Even with a camera like that, you may not see anything.
Okay.
And so again, we look for external injuries. They may or may not be there. We look for these more subtle signs and symptoms, which are not proof of strangulation. These are indicators. These are things that have been associated through studies with people that have been strangled.
Yeah.
So then at that point, we look a little bit closely for those petechial hemorrhages. And as I told you, Traditionally we were taught to look in the whites of the eyes, but what we know now is that those petechial hemorrhages may only be on the surface of the brain. We wouldn't see those.
Mm.
Doctors have found petechial hemorrhages in the roof of the mouth, the back of
Yeah.
the throat, inside the ear, the eyelids, on the scalp, under the hair. So there's a lot of places where we might have injuries that are visible, but are we looking in the right places than
Right.
just this cursory surface,
Yeah.
So then, so those things would indicate a strangulation occurred. We would hope to get that victim to the hospital to see the forensic nurse, who would be more invasive with their hands-on approach. I mean, an officer's not going to be touching the victim. Even the crime scene officer's not going to touch the victim survivor per se, but the forensic nurse will. And they have special cameras and special imaging tools and things, techniques that they use to document that, not just the physical injuries, but also to document those subtle signs and symptoms as well. They got more accurate tools to do that, that are clinical in nature, not
Hmm.
forensic in nature. If we do in fact have someone who has died as a result of strangulation, first, I hope that a forensic pathologist is actually the one that does it, because, again, we want someone who's trained to look at the dead, not the living, because they have a very unique eye for things. And one of the things they're going to look at is definitely the structures of the neck. They're going to be looking for bruising, subcutaneous bruising, so bruising under the skin,
Hmm.
or intramuscular bruising of the neck muscles, that may indicate pressure that caused a rupture. They're going to be looking specifically at the structures of the jugular vein, the carotid artery, to see if those are intact. Because what can happen during a strangulation isn't just compression or closure of those structures, but it's also called a carotid dissection. Those structures can also tear
They can break. Wow.
internally, and a forensic pathologist will open up those vessels to see if there was a carotid dissection that occurred. I mean, just looking at it from the outside, you may not know. You'd actually have to look inside that artery itself. Another thing that they'll do is
And I'm sorry,
they'll examine.
is that to a trained eye, to the like naked eye, is that
It's
apparent,
very hard to see.
or does it have to
Yeah,
be like microscopic and
it's not microscopic in nature, but unless you've seen it before, you would not recognize what you're looking at. The first time I saw some autopsy photos of a carotid artery that had been opened, I was like, well, okay, I know this is carotid artery, but I don't know what I'm looking at. And then the forensic pathologist said, this is what you're looking for, and can you see it in there now? And I was like, oh, I can see it now. And they're like, all right, that's a carotid dissection.
hmm,
So even to a layperson, it wouldn't be immediately known. You know it was some type of vessel, but you wouldn't know what the defect in the vessel was unless you're specifically trained.
yeah. Now I look at a lot of autopsy photos of strangulation cases, and I'm very familiar with the front of the neck at this point. Again, from a layperson's point of view,
Mm-hmm.
watching them deflect up, the skin deflect up, the different muscle layers and all that stuff. And sometimes it's just plain as day. There's like hemorrhaging
Mm-hmm.
in and around the neck, right? Actually, that reminds me. What is the most common manner of strangulation? Is it manual strangulation that is the most common one?
As far as to what I've seen, yes, is most commonly manual. But we know the other type of strangulation is by ligature.
Right.
Manual doesn't always mean by the hands. That's what I always have to tell the people that I train is, when someone says that they've been strangled, we typically think of the two-handed hold around the neck.
We see in movies
But
or whatever. Yeah.
yeah, but people are strangled with one hand, two hands, from the back, from the front, from the side. And then people are strangled by having a forearm pressed against their neck, a knee. Some people have had their head between another person's legs where there's like a scissor lock or a figure four leg lock around the person's neck. because not everybody's strangled standing up. Some people are strangled laying down
Yeah.
or fighting while they were on the ground, and that's the position that they were strangled in. So,
Okay, that's a perfect segue. We're talking again for those of you who are joining us. We are talking with Brian Bennett, who is a retired law enforcement officer in the state of South Carolina. He also teaches full time in I don't know how to say that perfectly, Brian, but you're an instructor for law enforcement personnel as well, right? So
well,
that
and
is
I was going to say, I also train doctors, nurses, paramedics, EMTs, prosecutors, and victim advocates.
all right. So it's not just cops. Good. Okay,
Yeah.
so we're talking about Madeline here now. Since you have expertise in domestic violence, in sexual assault, and in strangulation, I think that all three of those probably occurred in this case, right? Madeline was, well, first of all, Mr. Stearns was found with something like 1,700 photos on his Google Drive of pictures of him abusing Madeline. Not just other people, just her. And then there are like 35,000 other photos of other victims, and those could just have been things that he purchased or traded for. You know way more about that than I ever even want to. But some of the questions that have come up on our channel is, Madeline was taking hydroxyzine. It said that it kind of knocked her out a little bit. There are also other prescription drugs in the house that her mom was taking, anti-anxiety, antidepressants, stuff like that. And so a lot of us have just been guessing, like, could she have been in a struggle could she have been drugged and then woke up and realized this is what's happening to me and get into a struggle and then ultimately pay the price with her own life for it? Are there ways that investigators and medical legal death investigators, forensic pathologists would they be able to reconstruct and try to figure out what actually happened? Because I'm sure you go into a case as an investigator, probably with years of experience, having seen certain things happening, you probably know what the possibilities are, right?
Mm-hmm.
Are they able to reconstruct that? And if so, how are they able to do that?
Yeah. So what we would term that is drug facilitated SA. When we say drug facilitated SA, we're not always talking about illicit drugs. We're talking about the side effects of all kinds of pharmaceuticals. There's all kinds of effects or side effects, some of which could render someone not as lucid or as aware or completely unconscious. And sometimes in SA, the offenders will use illicit or prescription drugs or drugs of availability to render their target or their victim incapacitated in some way, either completely unconscious or just without the ability to resist being assaulted. Mm-hmm. So that certainly could be a possibility. Now, as it pertains to drug facilitated SA, one critical part of that would certainly be if law enforcement could obtain tissue samples and blood samples from the person who was subject to the SA. That would probably also lead to at least seeking search warrants or searches for what drugs, either illicit or prescription or over the counter, were available in the area or at the time that person was a victim of the SA. And then with those two things combined, your forensic pharmacists, essentially, or your forensic doctors, would start to kind of work up what are appropriate levels, because some people could actually be getting overdosed on something that they are actually prescribed. Right. They would look at what the therapeutic dosages were of something that they perhaps had a prescription for, but they would also be looking at things that they didn't have a prescription for or illicit drugs and seeing what those levels were in the tissues or the samples or blood samples that were taken. But they also have to understand that different drugs are metabolized at different rates in the body. Yeah. So there might be an indication that a particular drug was used to facilitate the SA, but at the time that the collection occurred, it had already metabolized completely out of the system, and therefore no trace of it is found.
Yeah.
In other
And her
cases,
body was found. Her body was found decomposing 4 or 5 days after she was dumped in a field, basically. So
yeah.
I'm sure that would impact their ability to make a good.
It certainly would, but I wouldn't say it's an impossibility with the technology of chemistry these days. Even trace elements and stuff can indicate different chemical compositions,
Yeah.
which could in fact the right professional might generate an opinion. It may not be a factual statement, but it could be a heavily weighted opinion
Expert
as
opinion.
to what was used. Yeah.
Yeah.
But the other interesting aspect of this is that, the strangulation aspect. It could be that she was incapacitated in some way and came to her senses to some degree and started to fight, and then strangulation was used. But I would also say, in the realm of SA, strangulation is used pretty frequently in place of drugs because it doesn't require a lot of pressure or a lot of force to render someone unconscious.
That actually was my next question. So, but that seems like they're riding a pretty thin line, right? That's dangerous. If you what is the difference between the amount of pressure it takes to incapacitate someone versus the amount of, I'm using the word pressure. I know that it's a more complex thing, but let's say the amount of application of strangulation to kill someone, that seems like it's probably a thin line. Stephen Stearns was like 6 feet tall, maybe 200, 210 pounds, something like that. And little Maddie was a 13-year-old little girl of average build. I would imagine that she wouldn't, and actually, I'm sorry, Brian, and this is probably way into the weeds here, but I grew up in a farming community, and I've been around death a lot, and not like human death a lot, but like animal death a lot, right? And it's surprising how easy it is to take life. So I guess I'm just wondering, you're kind of riding a very dangerous line if you're using strangulation as an incapacitation tool. Are you not?
Right. You're right. And so let's this is also something very startling. It doesn't, one of the reasons we don't see sometimes, at least in 50% of cases, we don't see those external injuries is because it actually doesn't take very much pressure at all to render someone unconscious, and the duration of pressure isn't long at all either. I'll give you a perfect example. This is what some national forensic and medical research has told us. It only takes about, first of all, let's talk about the structures of the neck that we're discussing.
All right.
We're talking about the carotid artery that takes your oxygenated blood from your heart and lungs to your brain.
Yes.
You have your jugular vein that takes the deoxygenated blood from your brain back to your heart and lungs, and you have your trachea. All right. Mm-hmm. So those are the three main structures that are affected during a strangulation, and more specifically defined as strangulation is a form of asphyxiation characterized by external pressure on structures of the head and neck that limit oxygen to the brain. That's the technical definition of strangulation. All right. That's quite different than choking.
Yeah, that's a great definition, and we talked about this earlier, right? The incapacitating part is just losing oxygen to your brain. You lose consciousness, right? It's not
Correct.
Not being able to breathe, because you can not breathe for a long time and still live.
Correct.
But, that's what CPR teaches us, right? Like over the years, we've gone from really focusing on getting oxygen in those lungs so that we can spread it out throughout the rest of the body. And now we're trained not to worry about that so much, just keep the blood flowing, right? So the strangulation, we are really talking about just oxygen to the brain and staying and either staying conscious or going unconscious, right?
Yeah, correct. And so when we're talking about pressure, I want people to understand that although those three structures are what's in play or what's affected, it doesn't have to be all of those structures at the same time to render someone unconscious. Any one of those structures with the correct pressure applied in the correct position can lead someone to be unconscious. So if if there's direct pressure on the carotid artery, and that pressure occludes it or closes off the carotid artery, you can get unconsciousness. If it just closes off the jugular vein, it can cause unconsciousness. If it closes off the trachea by itself, it can lead to unconsciousness. But typically, it's a combination in some way, shape, or form of all of those structures be involved. Maybe the carotid artery and the jugular vein, or the carotid artery and the trachea. But it only takes 4.5 pounds of pressure for about 5 seconds on your carotid artery to render you unconscious.
And the carotid artery, is it located kind of on the outside of the internal structure of the neck, right? It's vulnerable.
Right, correct. So, when people say, check for a pulse on someone's neck, well, if you follow your trachea and you come over here to the edge of your trachea and press in just a little bit, that's where your carotid artery is, right there. It's literally not too far below the surface of the skin, and your jugular vein is right behind that. So you don't have a lot of muscle or a lot of, and you don't have any bones right here. We'll talk about the hyoid bone in a minute. But there's nothing here that provides resistance to that compression. And so it's about 4.5 pounds pressure for your carotid artery for about 5 seconds. It's about 11 pounds of pressure to your jugular vein for a little bit longer, about 7 to 10 seconds. And it takes about 33 pounds of pressure to close off or occlude your trachea, where you might have circulation going, but you can't get air into your heart and lungs to put oxygen into your bloodstream. And so, again,
hey,
we talk about...
Can I real quick just...
Sure.
My buddy Kenny Clark, who's the forensic pathologist I was telling you about earlier, probably before we got on here, he told me a very, very similar, almost exactly what you just said. To my memory, it probably was exactly what you just said. But if you think about what it takes, what is 4.5 pounds of pressure? I was just in court where they talked about a double action revolver that did not have a hammer spur out of it. Just pulling the trigger, that was 12.3 pounds. Mm-hmm. So if you're used to using a double action handgun, that is 3 times the amount of pressure to pull the pressure that you use to pull the trigger is 3 times the amount of pressure that you would need to cause unconsciousness just by putting pressure on the carotid artery. Am I...
No, you're right. And here's a trivia question for you. How many pounds of pressure does it take to open a can of soda? 20 pounds of pressure per square inch to open a can of soda.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
20 pounds of pressure to open a can of soda. The average adult male handshake averages about 60 pounds of pressure per square inch on a firm, not bone breaking, but a firm adult handshake is 60 pounds of pressure per square inch. So we were talking about a very small amount of pressure for a very short duration is enough time to render someone unconscious. I've got 2 videos that I showed during my trainings. One is of a little girl. She's got to be all of about 9 years old. And her and her dad are practicing in their downstairs dojo doing mixed martial arts.
Yeah.
She gets on her dad's back, puts him in what they call a rear naked choke, which is a compression of the carotid artery and the jugular vein.
Yeah.
He is unconscious in 8 seconds from the time that she applies the hold to the time he goes out.
She's 9.
She's 9 years old. He is unconscious in 8 seconds. At about the 5-second mark, he knows that something's wrong because he says, it's kind of he can't really project himself very well, but he says, "Honey, please stop." And by the time he gets that out, 3 more seconds and he's out. Another video that I show is a lady that was walking down a sidewalk. This happened to be in South America, down in Brazil, but she was walking down the sidewalk in front of a hotel. This guy comes out of the darkness, grabs her from behind in a stranglehold. She is literally unconscious in about 5 seconds. She doesn't even know what hits her. He drags her off into the darkness and
perpetrates his crime. Yeah.
Perpetrates crime. So time and pressure and duration are so small. It's just that blows people's mind how much damage can be done with such little pressure and time.
Wow. So, we're talking about unconsciousness in 5-6 seconds, but and we kind of got into this subject because I brought up the idea that he's kind of riding the line here. There's I mean, what is the delta between like causing unconsciousness and causing death? How long is that?
So the studies that we had up until about 5 or 6 years ago, roughly they all agreed about 4 minutes with no oxygen to the brain, you're going to be clinically dead. However, those numbers have changed. The latest numbers that I've seen from the doctors and people that focus on this is 2 minutes or less without oxygen, and you will be dead. Now, there are lesser durations, like around 30 seconds, 45 seconds, a minute, where you may not die, but you will have permanent brain damage. I mean, people have to understand every second that your brain is without oxygen, there is permanent brain damage. There's like 230 million neurons that die every second you're unconscious from lack of oxygen. Now, you've got billions and billions and billions of those in your brain, but certainly the longer that you are unconscious and deprived of oxygen, the more exponentially rapid brain death and brain cell death occur. And so that's why that average number is around 2 minutes. But depending on people's maybe congenital issues with their health or comorbidities or other things going on with their body, that can be plus or minus some time.
Yeah, it's not univariate, right? There are many variables here that would
correct.
go into
And
that.
to what you related earlier about Madeline being seen slumped in his car, I don't remember all the timestamps from all the cameras, but when I did look at it, what I was thinking in my own mind is she was probably already deceased at that point.
Yeah.
If she had not moved, even in a matter of a couple minutes and was still in that kind of slumped position, that's telling me she hasn't regained consciousness to right herself, to make movements, to reach out or grab or have some type of spatial orientation.
Yeah.
And it indicates to me that she probably was deceased already. That's just my opinion.
That's what detectives would be looking for, though. Like, is there going from camera to camera to camera? Has she changed position? That would be like one of the main things that would indicate to them whether or not she was alive in the car.
Yeah. I mean, and let's face it too. I mean, driving around town and maybe the way he was driving, it might have moved the core of her body around, but is her head still in a position that indicated some type of awareness or consciousness? And it seemed like it was all kind of just slumped over.
Yeah.
Real quickly, the hyoid bone, this is one thing that kind of drives me crazy is you watch these, made for TV, murder shows.
Hyoid bone is broken. She was strangled.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like if you have a broken hyoid bone, it's an absolute strangulation. The fact of the matter is the hyoid bone doesn't break all that often. And the reason it doesn't is because when someone is strangled, instinctually, they lower their chin generally. And the hyoid bone is the only bone in the human body that is not connected to any other bone. It kind of rests and floats in the middle of a bunch of muscles and cartilage. And you have to have an incredible amount of pressure to overcome all this mass in someone's neck and then get up into the neck, because that hyoid bone actually kind of pushes up into the back of the throat.
Yeah.
So, I mean, yeah, you can have
it works to, like, when we move our tongue, the hyoid bone is part of that movement, right?
Right. Correct. And I mean, you could have a fractured hyoid bone. You could also have a fractured larynx. I mean, your larynx and your cartilage tissue can also fracture. But again, that's not an absolute.
I also understand that the hyoid bone is very flexible. The tissues are very flexible in young age. It's not until you're in your like mid to late 20s that it actually calcifies and becomes what we would consider one big bone. So I'm guessing in Madeline's case, she had a very pliable, soft hyoid bone. It may or may not have broken.
Yeah, correct. And again, I mean, that it could have been, when hyoid bones do break, some people say, well, they must have used a ligature, because ligature is essentially a ligature of any kind. It could be a USB power cord, a belt, an article of clothing, essentially maximizes increases pressure in a smaller area is what it does compared. But someone with strong enough hands and using their fingers in a certain way, like the thumbs or whatever, certainly could produce a fractured hyoid bone manually as well. So yeah. So again, when we're looking at our medical examiners, our pathologists, that's the things they're looking for. They're looking at the brain. They're looking at that hyoid bone. They're looking for hemorrhages in the muscles, the bruising. They're looking for compromised vein and artery structures. They're also looking at the eyes as well. There could be particular hemorrhages on the back of the eyes. I actually found out something a couple of years ago, and I didn't realize this, and I can't tell you all the science behind it, but I was told at a training for coroners, but they could also test the vitreal fluid in the eye, and the fluid in the eye can also indicate that a strangulation occurred. I don't know what test is done to establish that, but people that were eye specialists and like corneal transplant specialists that were there, they said that is something that could be detected just with the eyes itself in some cases.
Wow. Okay, so for the last 50 minutes, I have bogarted everybody's, like I could ask you question after question after question. Let me scroll through and see what I can find as far as a question. Here's one from Janet Brissett. A question for Brian: would the weather have made a difference in determining cause in Maddie's case? We talked before we came on about forensic weather experts, right? But what would weather have to do with Maddie's case?
I'm not aware of a weather aspect giving any type of determination in cause of death related to strangulation. Interestingly, weather might have to do with more timing of her death, because we talked before we came on about forensic meteorologists. There's actually people out there who are experts in the weather and astronomy who can actually tell time of day by sun position, shadows, and weather. And so that might have some relation into the time of her death, perhaps, if there was some type of visual indicators of what those conditions were in and around that situation. But I don't know of anything weather-wise. I will tell you, and this is something that very few people know, I'm actually doing some clinical forensic research that no one else is doing in the world related to thermal imaging and the detection of assault injuries that are not visible to the naked eye.
Oh, wow.
And no one else in the world is working on that. But this question is very interesting because temperature, as technology develops, temperature and how soon we might be able to interact with the live person or the deceased may allow us to see some things we did not know otherwise.
Wow. That's cool. All right. Lily Benjamin asks, Brian, did you work with Joseph Scott Morgan, or was that before your time? Also, thank you for your insights on or this evening. Do you know Joseph?
I do not know Joseph. I have not had the pleasure of meeting that individual.
I don't think I think he is in Jacksonville. No, that's in South Carolina. He's at Jacksonville University down there. He's a good guy. He's a medical legal death investigator. Really, really good guy. Let's see. Gavin, for the guest, that is you, Brian. What do you think about the psychology behind strangulation, specifically Madeleine's case, or just in general?
Okay, so this is really going to blow people's minds.
That's a good question, I think.
No, it's a great question, and this is something that I talk about in my training. The first thing I want people to know is that anyone who uses strangulation as a form of assault has a killer mindset. This is what we know. National data has shown us that non-fatal strangulation is the number one indicator of a future homicide.
Oh, wow.
Yes. Now, let me explain that, hash that out a little bit. When you say that, what most people relate to is domestic violence. Mm-hmm. They think that the homicide that we're talking about is going to be the targeted domestic violence victim. And commonly it is. Now, interestingly enough, when the homicide happens, it usually isn't by strangulation. It's actually by firearm. But strangulation was a precursor to using a firearm in about 70 to 77% of cases.
Wow.
But when we say number one indicator of future homicide, that is also homicides of other people. Let me give you an example. again, national data shows that 80% of critical incidents where law enforcement officers are shot or had to shoot, those suspects had a domestic violence history, but 30% of those had a history of strangling their intimate partners. So those stranglers are also your number one cop killers.
So
Additionally,
Okay.
let me add this. Additionally,
Yeah.
a number of our mass shooting events in the United States have been tied to individuals who had a history of strangling their intimate partners. So, for example, Omar Mateen, who did the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando, the media and everybody said that he was sympathetic to ISIS and stuff like that. That's why he did it. Well, that might be true, but he had a documented history of strangling his intimate partners. We have Esteban Santiago, who did the Miami airport shooting.
Mm-hmm.
He had a history of strangling his intimate partners in Alaska. He was actually charged with a domestic violence charge up there, but pled to a non-domestic violence charge, which kept him off the.
That kills me.
They kept him off the FBI firearm prohibition list.
Yeah.
He bought a gun. He flew with that gun to the Miami airport, got it off the check bag, loaded up in the airport, and killed people. And then lastly, another example among many.
He had checked that weapon, probably the ammunition too.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, he didn't carry it with him from Alaska. It was a check bag. And then you have Devin Kelly in Sutherland Springs, Texas. He killed 26 people with an AR-15. But what's interesting about that case, he was dishonorably discharged from the Air Force because he committed a domestic assault against his wife and strangled his son, who was a minor. He was convicted in a military court of domestic violence, but his domestic violence conviction was not reported to the FBI database, which allowed him to buy that AR-15. He went to that church with the intentions of killing his wife. She wasn't there, and he ended up killing 26 other people. That's just 3 examples of mass shooters who, prior to those shootings, had a history of strangling their intimate partners. So when someone is using strangulation against anybody, I've seen cases of children being strangled, vulnerable adults, kidnapping victims, you name it, human trafficking victims. You are dealing with someone who has the psychology and the mindset of a killer.
So let me ask you this. Is there a distinction between somebody who, how do I put this, who has a history of strangulation because of violence, or somebody who has a history of strangulation because of sexual gratification? Is there a distinction between those two things?
Those things can be separate, but also combined. There's sometimes a nexus between the two. So when you look at the psychology of the criminal mind, specifically of those who abuse and those who kill, oftentimes is tracked back to something called their ACE score, which is adverse childhood experiences. There's a lot of research that's been done on that show, it used to be this thing of, well, if you've been exposed to violence as a child, you're predisposed to be violent. That's not necessarily true. But what we do know is that there has been a correlation between adverse childhood experiences and the propensity for future violence. With respect to sexual gratification, there are those who are sexually gratified through the act of strangulation, not as a medical, physiological heightened arousal, but as a intellectual, mental arousal of having someone's life in their hand.
Oh, yeah.
And so... but there's also those that have a combination of the emotional, psychological arousal and a biological sexual response arousal when strangling or being strangled themselves. So there's kind of separate schools on that, but there's a nexus sometimes where they blend together.
Wow. Great question, Beck. I appreciate that question. Jerry asks, what does Brian think about the photo of Stephen Stern's knuckles raw red injured? I don't know if you've seen those. Let me, hey, actually, Brian, I'm going to like do a shameless self-promotion here for a second, but over on the website, I've got tons and tons, and I'm sorry, this is a slide, Brian. Brian, you can hear us and we can hear you. This isn't a
Okay.
slide that I put your picture on. I wasn't thinking about using it, but I've got all this stuff over on the website, including and Brian, you can see what I'm looking at here, right?
Yes.
So I think what Jerry was talking about are things like these on his knuckles, kind of these
Correct.
superficial scratching wounds. There were some. I think they're pointing out these ones here. He said that it was because he scuffed his hand as he was changing his tire. There's a
I've
mark
actually
up.
heard that. I've actually heard that excuse before in some of my previous cases of changing a tire.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, in this
so
case, there was a flat. There was like it definitely happened,
right.
but
So this is what I would be thinking. Again, I'm just putting my opinion out there. Uh, During a strangulation assault, it would not be unusual for the victim to have their hands wrapped over the top of the person who is strangling them in an attempt to release the pressure and release the hold.
sure.
Um,
Yeah.
so those superficial wounds would be consistent with someone who might have been trying to break the hold. Um, and the other, obviously, clinical forensic part of this that I would look at would be her hands and her fingernails. Now, I know that her body was decomposed, but again, with the great forensics that we have these days, it may be possible if, in fact, she did scratch him. Um, there may be some chance at DNA retrieval, but DNA biologically degrades very, very quick.
Yeah.
They might be able to say, well, there's human material under her fingernails, but we don't know of whom.
Yeah.
But those marks could have come from her, but it also could have come from if she happened to be fighting while he was trying to get a hold on her neck. He could have also hit and brushed those knuckles against parts of a structure nearby or an
Yeah.
object nearby, wherever it happened to be. I can't say that it was in the car; it could be somewhere else, but it could happen in that environment as well.
Yeah. That's a great question. Hey, real quick, while I'm being shamelessly self-promoting, guys, we are coming up on we were here. Look at this. We're over 95,000 people in our community now, which is pretty fun. Sorry, Brian. I just had to put that in there because I'd like
That's great, man.
we've had some growth happening over the last little bit. But great question, Jerry. Let's see what else. Amanda says, Gavin, does Brian believe strangulation is a particularly intimate homicide? Tell me what you think on that, and then I would love to know what an intimate homicide is, if there is like an actual definition of this.
Right. So, because I don't know the basis of her question, because two things immediately came to mind. Since SA was mentioned being part of this case,
For like 5
intimate,
years,
right?
repeated
So,
over.
so the word intimate could mean something of a sexual nature.
Yeah.
Or homicide related to something of a sexual nature. But I could also relate intimate to what I call a very close up and personal type of assault versus, someone's shooting a gun across the street, at 5 people. That is spatially, that's a very far away. But whenever you punch somebody in the face, that's a more up close and intimate type of assault. It's not strangulation, obviously. It's a punch in the face. So that the word intimate could have 2 different meanings. It certainly could have a basis in in a sexual way, but it also could mean that it's a very personal type of assault. In that, again, when we talk about human trafficking victims and kidnapping victims and vulnerable adults and children, there may not be any type of sexual intimacy as part of those. But those people and the people around that would definitely say that was an up close and personal. When you're looking at somebody in their face when their life is draining out of their body, I mean, that's an intimate, personal experience.
If we take it out of like the crime realm, I was just writing a story for my day job about a guy who is a hunter. He loves the sport of hunting. I'm not a hunter. I don't understand it, but I know, for example, there are people that will go into the wilderness and they will hunt boars with knives. And then there are people that
Mhm.
will go into the wilderness and they will shoot a deer from 50, 60, 100, 150 yards away, right?
Mhm.
It probably does take a different mindset to do those two things. And I think, I don't know that that perfectly translates over to what we're talking about here, where we're
Mhm.
not talking hunting, we're talking about murder, right? But I think what most of us want to know here is like, is it a different kind of person who's willing to take a life with their own hands versus a tool from far, far away?
Yeah, I believe so. And just in my own experience and that of other law enforcement professionals and forensic psychologists that I've talked to, yeah, the mindset's different because because the mechanism and the technical part of it is so close. I mean, you have to be within that person's personal space, that personal bubble that we all have. You
Right.
have to be in that space to do this. And for some people, distance allows them to disassociate from the individual, and they're just focused on causing the damage, not who the damage is on. But this is very, very intentional to the
Well, and
person.
not to mention, like, he had been living in the same home with her for years and had been in a fatherly kind of role for years. So, yeah, that's this next question. I'll bring it up. But just as kind of a background here, the timeline, and this won't be perfect, but the timeline here, Brian, is that uh, Jennifer Soto, who is Madeline's mom, took her prescription drug, which makes her go to sleep, is what she says, and she fell asleep around 11:30, wanting a good night's sleep. And I don't follow the logic here, and I don't think anybody follows the logic here. Wanting a good night's sleep, she says she sent her daughter upstairs to her ex-boyfriend's room to share a bed with him so that she could get a good night's sleep, even though she had taken a drug that would knock her out. So it doesn't makes no sense. But the timeline is she was last seen about 11:30. And then Stephen Stern said he took her early to school because they're planning on going to McDonald's. She didn't want McDonald's, conveniently, because she was dead. So I guess the question here from Pretty 393 is, in your professional opinion, was Maddie killed in the very early morning, or shortly after she was sent into the bed of her alleged killer or accused killer, or was it sometime early in the morning? I mean, I know that you don't have like access to the whole case file, but what does your gut tell you on this?
My gut tells me that it was shortly before he took her to school.
Oh, really?
Um, yeah, that's my opinion on it, and I'll tell you why. And I think the best law enforcement officers think like criminals. You have to. And if I was this guy, I have more control of the what I call the scene inside that car. It's a much smaller area I have to be concerned about as far as leaving trace information or trace evidence in the confines of that car. It's easier to clean. It's easier to clean up. It's easier to dispose of things than that house setting, because he would have to worry about, number one, mom waking up. Not he wouldn't know exactly when she might be awake or be lucid to perhaps walk in on something. And then that's another question of, well, if she did, would he then have to do something to the mother to cover it up? Um, the amount of stuff that he would have to manage if it occurred in the house would be exponentially larger than that trip from the house to the school and that area of the car and its interior to the school.
Whoa.
So that's why I think it was probably um,
Well, maybe I
sometime.
should. You think it was in the car, not in the house?
I think so.
Maybe
Again,
I should.
that's my opinion.
Maybe I should be relieved that I don't think like a criminal, because I've always just assumed it happened in the house. Like, in the middle of the night, he's abusing her and uh, goes too far, or she struggles, or something like that. But what you're saying is it's way more controllable if it happens in the car than it does if it's in the house.
Well, and the part of the reason I have that opinion is because her essay had been happening for so many years, likely inside the house. He's very to do that inside the house under the roof where her mother is. He has to be a very methodical person to try to plan on how to cover that up. I mean, I don't want to get too graphic here, but moms and daughters have some common things that they share, and moms can probably pick up on some very subtle things about their daughters that dads wouldn't or men wouldn't. And he would have to think about all these things and have planned to hide things for quite a long time and get away with it. You know, he might for a moment be like, well, I can get away with it one more time. But I think to the point that this led to this homicide, I think that took him to a different level, and he probably knew that would be something that in the house he just couldn't explain away or get rid of quick enough, fast enough with any reasonable explanation. I mean, if it happened in the room, he's got sheets and a bed and maybe some clothes, and then, perhaps noises that might raise the mother's awareness and raise her out of her stupor. I mean, there's so many things that I think would overload how technical he thought he was. And perhaps to simplify things, that area of the car being much smaller, that car is something he controls much more intimately. He controls the route of his travel. He controls what he disposes of. And he also has time to perhaps plan better an alibi, although it didn't work out very well with the technology and cell phones and the cameras. That's something he obviously didn't account for during that trip.
Yeah. Well, I honestly had never considered that it took place anywhere but inside the apartment. Obviously, the forensic searches of both the car, his Jen Soto's, the mother's car, the apartment, those would all give signals to investigators about where the crime actually happened, right?
Correct.
All right. Chrissy the Crone, just Chrissy the Crone says, usually how long does strangulation take? I think we talked about this a little bit, but can you repeat that?
Yeah, so as far as the act of strangulation takes a matter of seconds. I guess really what perhaps the question would be consciousness, because I tell people there's no such thing as an attempted strangulation. You're either strangled or you're not.
Okay.
And so again, if we're talking about the simple definition of external pressure on the veins and arteries in the trachea, which are the structures of the neck, which by compression would prevent oxygen to the brain. Well, in the first milliseconds of that happening, a strangulation is taking place.
Yeah.
The question perhaps then becomes, at what point does someone become incapacitated or dead? And it takes a matter of seconds to minutes. So it doesn't take very long at all. But to actually meet the definition of strangulation is literally a matter of milliseconds to meet the technical definition.
So I've got this is one of these things I sometimes overshare, but somebody that I know took his own life while in prison. And my parents were very, very upset about it. And I had a conversation with my mom, and I said, he did the regular prison thing with the sheets, and, he could have saved himself by simply standing up, kind of a thing, right? And my mom was so worried about his last moments on earth. And I told her, based on what my friend Kenny told me, Mom, he just had to be determined for like 5 seconds.
Correct. Absolutely correct.
And then it was done. It may have taken minutes, but he wasn't there for those minutes. He was already unconscious, right?
And as an example of that, I know we're not getting this, but I think this is a perfect way for me to explain this. We have something called autoerotic asphyxiation.
Yeah.
And that is where someone essentially creates a ligature and strangles themselves to heighten their sexual climax.
Mm-hmm.
Interestingly enough, the actor David Carradine died this
Right.
way.
In a closet in a hotel, right?
Correct. And it doesn't happen with a lot of frequency, but it does happen with those individuals. And the reason it happens is because the onset of unconsciousness happens so quick, they don't have the ability to save themselves. So, like you said, that determination for 5 seconds. And the previous example I told you of the girl practicing jujitsu, her dad was out in 8 seconds. By the time he realized there was a problem, that was about the 5 second mark, and it was over. And he couldn't have saved himself. Only she would have been able to.
That knowing that actually might bring a little comfort. Little Maddie, it's not like the movies where you're fighting in an alley and the assailant's on top of you and you're like, it's not like that. It's like once the pressure is on, it's done. It happens very quickly, right? So Madeline likely lost consciousness and lost her life without all that much struggle. And I mean, that's kind of crass maybe to say, but I think that we can find those of us who maybe are overly empathetic, and sympathetic to, which I am. I mean, that's why I talk about this. Yeah, she probably did not suffer at all. I think she was probably gone really, really fast. All right, let's see. This is another one. Just Chrissy the Crone. With strangulation, what type of transfer evidence is there that can prove the perp?
Yeah. So there's a couple different things that we might have. Let's talk about ligature. So when a ligature or something that is not one of our body parts is used, and ligatures generally are going to be some type of linear device. Like, again, I've known some cases where people were strangled with USB power cords, the coax cable from the cable TV, articles of clothing.
It's not necessarily like the French garrote, a tool. It's like a tool of convenience, right?
Right. So ligatures can leave patterns, pattern injuries, which can indicate the type of ligature used. I mean, if there's a particular belt with a certain amount of belt loops and spacing, or ropes and their braiding, that's commonly what we see with some of the ligatures is those patterns. So that's one thing, is a pattern transfer of evidence that indicates the ligature used. We also may have some serological evidence and DNA evidence through the fluffing off of skin cells.
Tell people what you mean by serology. What is serology?
Serology is trace evidence derived from the blood or fluids in the body.
Okay. Sweat.
So you got sweat. You got saliva. Yeah, I mean, this is where you get like suffocations, where people get a pillow put over their face, and later they find the pillow or the cloth in the pillow, and the victim's saliva is in the fabric of the pillow. Gotcha. Things like that. So you have some serological, some fluid body evidence. Again, we have sometimes sloughing of skin under the fingernails or on the surface of the skin. There's also touch DNA these days. People may not realize that DNA has advanced that far. Now, touch DNA has most of its foundation in a person touching an inanimate object. That's like, for example, if there's been a shooting and there's shell casings behind, or a gun, well, the first thing they would do years ago was try to get fingerprints off of that. Mm-hmm. Sometimes fingerprints are not available on that, but touch DNA these days are. They may not have a fingerprint on a shell casing, but they can retrieve DNA that can still identify. Well, there's probably some science out there, and with the correct collection, there might be some touch DNA that is preserved on the victim's body. I mean, if you look at, again, going back to forensic nurses, this is the stuff they're great at. I won't go too in depth into the exam because it's a very invasive.
It's personal.
Yes, very personal. But it's safe to say that these forensic nurses, if they're involved, they swab everything.
Right.
I mean, from head to toe, for the sole purpose of picking up on this trace biological evidence, whatever it is, skin cells, saliva, I mean, you name it, they're looking for it. And so and I imagine with the advent of technology and as it goes forward, it'll just get better and better. But what I mentioned are some of the more common things that we would look for.
Cool. Let's see. We've been going like an hour and 20 minutes here, Brian. Have you got a couple more minutes in you?
I've got as much time as you want.
All right. Michelle asks, is it true that fingerprints can now be lifted from the skin of a strangulation victim?
I haven't actually seen it done, but as again, and I've got a very diverse training background, not just in strangulation, domestic violence, but lots of criminal science type stuff. Years ago, we could get fingerprints off of a broken brick that's been sitting in the rain. We could actually get fingerprints off of with the right tools and the right materials. So I would say that is likely possible. I haven't seen it done, but with what I know that we could do and what we actually practiced, 10 or 12 years ago and where it is now. And again, the fact that I just touched on DNA, I definitely see that as being a possibility. And with relation to fingerprints, this hasn't become mainstream yet, but there was a study here in South Carolina at the University of South Carolina School of Physics where they were able to retrieve fingerprints using steam and a thermal camera when the fingerprints had been, how do I put this? The fingerprints, this was a lab test, but blood that had been diluted by over 1,000%.
All right.
On a finger, they were able to lift ridge detail on fingerprints using steam and a thermal camera on different fabrics and different surfaces.
Wow. I love necessity is the mother of invention right here. And criminals give us necessity to figure out new things there. And it's really fascinating, the science that goes into criminal justice. Let's see. Art just asked if we had a toxicology report on Maddie. We do not, Art. All in Tanks says, question for Brian. What about if she was thrown over the fence? Would that break the hyoid bone possibly?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, however, if that was the case, she would have obvious external trauma to that area. I tell people there's an acronym that we use in the medical field called CAF, contusion, abrasion, laceration, and fracture. That is blunt force trauma. Those are injuries caused by blunt force trauma.
Right.
People think, well, laceration is blunt force trauma. Yeah, laceration isn't when you get cut with an edge with something sharp. That's an incision or an incised wound. A laceration comes from blunt force trauma. So the amount of average pressure it takes a hyoid bone is about 60 pounds of pressure per square inch. If she was thrown over a fence and landed on her neck in some way to cause that, I would expect to see some obvious trauma to the external part of her body.
And while, she was dead, allegedly when this happened, right? But so there wouldn't be any kind of vital response like bruising or something, but there would be other forms of trauma. Right. Yeah,
there'd probably be some type of abrasion. Because the body would have to hit and then slide or torsion in some way as it moved off of that.
Yeah.
So there'd probably be some type of even slight surface abrasion with that the texture of that fence.
Michelle, I've heard that the hyoid bone mostly breaks after prolonged strangulation. True or false?
False. People can be strangled for minutes. Really, what breaks the hyoid bone is the amount of pressure. So if you have extreme amounts of pressure for a short period of time, it can happen. Or you've got people that are strangled for minutes on end with just enough to keep them unconscious, but not break the hyoid bone.
Yeah, there's just, I keep on bringing up Kenny, my pathologist friend. Every time I ask him what I think is a simple question, the answer is always, well, there are so many variables here. Let me give you a couple of, examples. All right. Damn True Crime Addict says, Gavin, can you explain? I will ask Brian to explain the difference between strangulation and suffocation. Are they basically the same? I know it's a lack of oxygen.
Yeah. Both of those are forms of asphyxiation. So asphyxiation is just the brain and body being deprived of the necessary oxygen for life. So drowning is a form of asphyxiation.
Right.
Um, Suffocation is a form of asphyxiation where the nose and mouth are covered, not that there's external pressure on the structures of the neck. So that's suffocation, limiting the path of air into the body. And then, if you, some people might remember, it's actually just came on the radio the other day that it was the anniversary of Payne Stewart, the golfer,
Hmm.
dying in a plane crash. And
Yeah.
what people may remember is that their plane had depressurized, and because they were at such high altitude, they had no oxygen. So they essentially died by asphyxiation because they were in a high environment of no oxygen. It's called anoxic brain injury.
Yeah.
And so strangulation and suffocation are similar in the sense that that's just a form of asphyxiation. Each of them are different.
So we would not call drowning suffocation. We would not call what happened to Payne Stewart suffocation. Those are
No.
suffocation is specifically covering up
Mhm.
the airway.
Correct.
Wow,
Yeah.
man, that's fantastic. Let's see, we got a couple super chats that came in. I appreciate that, guys. Terry Cat says, "Thank you, Gavin, for giving us all the information on the case. By the way, there's a phone call that came out of prison. Stephen Stern's calling his dad. See if you can get it. Very interesting." Ooh, I will.
Can I talk about that for a moment?
Yeah, please do.
Okay, so a lot of people are not aware that those jailhouse phone calls are probably monitored, and this is why I say probably.
Probably.
Um, when people go to jail or prison and they use those phones, there's a sign near that phone that says your phone calls may be monitored or recorded.
Yeah.
The only time that they have an expectation of privacy is when they're talking to their legal counsel.
Right.
All right. So when people call in to the jail or the prison and they use the inmate's number to get them on the phone, or the inmate calls out, those
Or
lines are
or even the
recorded.
video conferences. They're recorded.
Correct.
Yes.
Correct. And so there have been quite a few cases, and actually in some of the criminal investigation courses that I've taught, I actually talk about monitoring jailhouse phone calls to obtain not just evidence, but to gain clues on what evidence we need to find and where it may be.
Well, I've covered a couple of cases where they brought up, actually just this last week, they brought up a recording, a video call between the defendant and his wife. And I was just sitting, and they were speaking in code. They thought that they were being brilliant speaking in code, but it's like a fourth grader that can understand what it is that they're talking about, right? There was another one where this guy was, it was a case that I covered again in court where the guy was talking about, like, he full on was describing like a treasure map, and the treasure was where the evidence was, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
he's talking in this code as if he's some pirate of the Caribbean from 400 years ago, and we're all just going, yeah, got it, yep, yeah, that's where the evidence, and the police just went right to it. It's just, again, my ironclad law of criminal mastermindery is always applicable. If you think you have what it takes to be a criminal mastermind, that is evidence in and of itself that you do not have what it takes to be a criminal mastermind. PJ Tyler with the super chat says, "Thank you for spending time with us this evening, Brian." Thank you, Brian. Hope you come back with us again, and I hope you do too. This has been fascinating, and we
I would
deeply
absolutely love
appreciate
to.
it. Good. How can people get in touch with you? Or do you have a website? Or
Yeah.
yeah,
So the best way to get in touch with me, quite frankly, is a Facebook group page that I created. Is Strangulation Law for SC. SC stands for South Carolina. The reason I created that group page is South Carolina is the only state in the country that does not have a specifically defined strangulation criminal statute.
you're kidding.
No, I'm not. I've been working on that since 2018. The last two holdouts over the last few years were Ohio and South Carolina. Ohio passed their law either last year or the year before.
Wow.
South Carolina, I've actually co-authored the bills here in South Carolina since 2018. We've had three legislative sessions. Our legislative sessions last 2 years. So we've had three legislative sessions. One just ended where the strangulation bill didn't even go up for discussion. So I am working in that area. I'm doing some legislative work. Yep, there it is, right there.
This is you.
That thermal image is actually an image I took.
Wow.
Yeah, so
I'm seeing fingers.
yeah, if you were to see the regular, actually, if you don't mind, Gavin, if people go on the internet and type in my name, Brian Bennett, and non-fatal strangulation, there's a national article that I wrote called "Subtle Signs of a Killer." It is on the officer.com website.
Yep.
And they can go on there and see a very comprehensive article. And if you scroll through those images, there's an image directory, I think, right under that gallery, right there, the blue one. If you switch on that, that's what it looks like with a regular camera.
Yeah.
And if you cycle through, that's thermal.
Wow. Yeah. No signs.
Yeah.
So how long after the hand was removed from that neck did that take?
It's like 15 minutes.
Wow.
But again, this is the clinical forensic research that I'm doing. There's another article called "Beneath the Surface" on that same website.
Okay.
Where this was back in, I think, 2016, where I talked about the use of thermal imaging in the detection or using thermal imaging to possibly detect non-visible injuries. And that's why I said that I'm the only person in the world doing that clinical forensic research, and I've had interest from 6 countries around the world. I've had interest from Brazil, New Zealand, Canada, Russia, and South Korea.
Wow.
It's the thermal imaging has been used in the clinical world of veterinary medicine and human medicine for approximately 20 years. But we've never thought about using it in criminal forensic evidence collection. So I am now researching the use not just for non-fatal strangulation, but any type of assault. When you talk about children who cannot articulate where they hurt,
right,
or vulnerable adults who are nonverbal, and the good thing about this is it's non-invasive. It doesn't require any hospital visit. It's non-invasive. It doesn't hurt the body whatsoever. Nobody's getting radiated. And
well, if police officers had that equipment on their person when they respond to a call of domestic violence, and they go there and they say, "I can't see any bruising. I can't see any redness or swelling. Let me take a look real quick with this."
Right.
And a lot of those calls are like right after the event took place.
Correct. And then that's what I'm studying is, the in-office equipment so there's medical doctors all over the world that use this for breast cancer detection, diabetic ulcers, sports injuries, all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
But again, forensically, it hasn't been used for criminal forensics. But the idea behind it is if we have something that's field portable and can be used by a police officer, a paramedic, one of the triage nurses at the hospital, it doesn't prove, who did it. It doesn't prove anything criminal, but it indicates an injury that then when we do get to a medical facility, we can say more affirmatively, something is going on here.
Yeah.
And
let me see if I understand this real quick. Because what occurred to me when you said like sports injuries. So like if you sprain your ankle, there is an amount of heat that is generated in the body in that space because of what the body is doing, sending platelets to it and so forth. So I was thinking that this was like touch heat, like transferred heat because I put my hand on your neck, but that's not the case. It's trauma that is
it could
that the
be
body
touch
is reacting to.
Correct. It could be touch heat, but it also could be the medical physiological response of the body to healing.
Yeah.
And when you read that Beneath the Surface article, I talk about where did early thermography, how soon was thermography used in the diagnosis or indication of sickness, and it's actually back during the Roman and Greek era.
Wow.
The physicians would spread wet mud on people, and wherever the mud dried the quickest, they would indicate that that was where a problem was. So,
Wow.
we might be able to see pattern injuries relatively quickly, but even if we don't see pattern injuries, maybe in the days and hours after that, we start to see the body's response. And
Right.
There's a doctor in Brazil, Dr. Marcos Brioski. He actually has some diabetic clinics, and he also helps with the Brazilian national team. And he can actually use thermal cameras to show the soccer players where they are going to get an injury before they actually get an injury.
Wow.
He can actually see stress in the body and vascular damages that they can't feel yet.
That is cool.
He can pre-treat it, basically.
Listen, so everybody you can find Brian at on Facebook, Strangulation Law for SC. You can also just search his name, and you can find these kinds of articles on officer.com that we've looked at. Brian, thank you very much for joining us tonight. I really appreciate it, and I hope that we get you back soon.
I would absolutely enjoy the opportunity.
Cool. And stick around for a second, okay? Hey, guys, real quick, let's just check in on, let's see, where am I going over here? Let's just check in on our numbers here. Yep, we're a growing community. We're well over 95,000. Thank you so much for enjoying the content and engaging and giving us your messages and your questions. I love this kind of stuff. We will have Brian on back again. We'll have more guests on back again as we continue to look into these cases that we all deeply care about, including the case of Madeline Soto. I will not be back on Saturday or Sunday, but I am planning on coming back on Monday. It again will be at 7:30 p.m. Eastern. So if you do like this kind of content, please plan on that. If you would like to get a notification, like if your YouTube notifications aren't working, head on over to the Fish Tank on Facebook, join the group. Autumn and Jamie send out notifications before we go live. So definitely do that. And with that, I will bid you adieu, and I will see you on the next one. Thanks for being here. Take care. Thank you very much for watching this video. If you liked what you saw, please consider subscribing. And if you have any questions or comments, please leave them below.